Welcome to Civil War class. Our next lesson is called Effects of War. Our objectives are to recognize the failure of two armies to adapt to change and understand the effects war had on the North and the South. Look at your vocabulary words. Something that is extremely good or bad is acute. Old-fashioned or outdated is archaic. The basic level of a complex system or organization is an infrastructure. A saying or rule about any particular group is a maxim. The right to vote is suffrage. The firing of a large number of weapons simultaneously is a volley. Effects of war. Please be aware that this lesson contains graphic pictures of Civil War casualties located in the slideshow titled After the Battle. One of the truths about being human is that every generation that comes along is different from the one before it. What worked 20 years ago does not work today. This is the main reason there are issues between teenagers and their parents. Mom and Dad remember when, while the teenager only sees the now. There's nothing wrong with either. The key to successful living is being able to adapt to change. The ability to adapt to a changing world can make all the difference between success and failure. The Civil War was a prime example of what happens when two opposing armies fail to adapt to change. Today you'll learn about this failure and how it affected the citizens of the United States. The art of war. Okay, in your notes, go ahead and put today's date. We're going to talk about the art of war. War has been a part of the human experience since the first time two people disagreed over an issue and began fighting. Sometime around 600 BC, a man by the name of Sun Tzu wrote a book about military tactics. His work, The Art of War, is one of the oldest known books about military strategy. Besides being one of the oldest, it is still considered one of the greatest works on the subject of warfare some 2,500 years later. Now fast forward to 1800 and the Napoleonic Wars for a moment. Okay, well before we do that, let's write this down. Sun Tzu wrote a book called The Art of War. The Art of War. And remember, it's a book, so we underline it. Okay. Now fast forward to 1800. I didn't put the year on that, did I? I'm sorry. 600 BC. Okay, around 600 years before Christ. Now fast forward to 1800 and Napoleonic Wars for a moment. Napoleon Bonaparte completely altered the strategy of war. He listed 115 maxims for successful military strategy, borrowing bits and pieces from different military commanders and adapting them to his own ideas. He totally changed the way war was fought. As a result, the French were able to become one of the great military powers of the day, defeating much larger armies in convincing fashion. Napoleon's ideas were advanced in book form by Antoine Henri Jomini, a Frenchman who had served under him. Okay, Napoleon he altered the strategy of war. So he altered war strategy. And this is in about 1800. Okay, it was this work that the military academy at West Point used as a primary source for military strategy. Every general that fought in the Civil War had a great deal of knowledge about Jomini's book. Okay, so Jomini is the one that wrote a book about it. Okay, wrote a book about the war strategy. Okay. Since Napoleon was considered one of the greatest strategists in history, it seemed only natural to learn from him. As a result, much of the Civil War and the battles fought in it were based on Napoleonic strategy. This turned out to have a disastrous effects on the men who participated in the conflict. Okay, this book was used at West Point. Military Academy. Now, you may not realize it, but all the generals who fought in the Civil War, in fact, everybody that fought in the Civil War went to West Point, whether they were for the North or the South. All of them went to this military academy. Okay? Napoleonic strategy was based on the weapons used in 1800. The muskets and cannons of old were terribly inaccurate, so large groups of soldiers could mass together. By 1860, both of these had undergone vast improvements in accuracy and size. Unfortunately, all the military leaders had learned tactics from 60 years earlier and failed to adapt. Okay. See, this was written about 1800. The war is in 1860. The book used, I'm going to say, outdated weapons. Now remember, the war starts in 1861. Both of these had undergone vast improvements in accuracy and size. Unfortunately, all the military leaders had learned tactics from 60 years earlier and failed to adapt. They still tried to go by the book instead of adapting it to the weapons that they had. Consequently, large masses of troops marching in formation across open fields no longer represented the kind of threat they once did. They used outdated weapons and outdated strategies. Maybe you can squeeze that word strategies in there. The combination of outdated tactics and advanced weaponry created total chaos on the battlefield. I'm going to put they failed to adapt. Hundreds of men would be mowed down in just a few volleys of musket fire. Cannon shells were no longer just balls, but canisters that exploded, raining shrapnel in all directions. These new weapons also created a multitude of more serious wounds, the kind field surgeons were not equipped to handle. Many of the great advancements we enjoy in medicine today are fairly recent. During the Civil War, the medical field was still somewhat archaic by our standards. Consequently, the terrible wounds inflicted on the battlefield caught doctors unprepared, based on the training they had been given. Due to the inability of doctors to repair serious wounds, many soldiers had arms or legs amputated. In fact, nearly 1/5 of all wounded Civil War soldiers were amputees. Okay, so it says that the medical field was, I'm going to use their word, archaic. Therefore, the doctors weren't prepared to deal with the kind of injuries that happened in the war. So many soldiers, it says 1/5 of the wounded soldiers were amputees. One-fifth of the wounded were amputees. They had something amputated. In addition, infection was widespread, and often a soldier would survive an amputation only to die from infection or disease later. In fact, of the 600,000 men and women who died in the Civil War, only a third of them died in battle. Okay, so there was infection. It said 600,000 men and women died in the Civil War. 600,000. It says only a third of them died in battle. One-third died in battle. So altogether there were 600,000 fatalities in the war, but only a third of them died in battle. The rest of them all died of infection. The rest would succumb from diseases and infections. These staggering losses had a terrible effect on the nation. Not only were the seriousness and number of wounds numbing, but the impact they had in other ways proved difficult to overcome. Okay, now let's talk about the North. Okay, the North. Unlike the South, very little of the war was fought in the North. As a result, few Northerners had to experience the terrible and bloody aspects of the conflict. However, there were many challenges to be faced. As the war progressed and the need for additional troops became a focus of attention, younger and younger men began enlisting in the Army. It was not at all unusual to have boys as young as 17 enlisting to fight. There are documented cases of 14-year-old boys being killed in combat. Okay, so 14-year-olds enlisted. Another issue that developed was the war dragged on was the staggering debt of the waging war. The federal budget increased by nearly 20 times, creating the need for additional taxation and other means to raise the funds necessary to continue fighting. Okay. So the debt it costs to have a war. And since they have debt, and this causes taxes. One major benefit the North enjoyed over the South was the ability to continue conducting foreign trade. As the industrial might of the North grew in order to meet the needs of the war, many products were being shipped overseas. Much of the labor came from women whose husbands were fighting. Okay, and we talked about that the North is still able to trade. Okay. In fact, the notion that women were supposed to stay at home and raise children while the men went off to work vanished in the face of mounting losses. They were trading. You have to remember, the women were the ones making the products. Because the men were at war. More and more often, women were employed in factories, offices, and nursing professions. All these were areas once totally dominated by men. It's no wonder that women's suffrage movement made strides during this era. The Civil War took its toll on the North through the loss of many young lives and the social challenges that were brought about by the need for thousands of women in the workplace. But these effects were nothing in comparison to the catastrophe faced in the South. Okay, so we said the effects of the war, the North, they were enlisting younger and younger, the debt of the war, which created taxes, and they were still able to trade. The women were making the products, so the women were starting to go to work now. Instead of staying at home, they had to go get a job to support themselves and their family because their husbands were at war. Now let's talk about the South. The Confederacy suffered through a whole series of major issues as a result of the war. The most damaging was the blockade of its port cities. Unlike the North, the Confederacy wasn't able to have a healthy exchange of trade with foreign nations. And we've said this before. I'm going to put Union blockade because their ports were blocked, so they couldn't trade. The most damaging was the blockade of its port cities. Unlike the North, the Confederacy was unable to have a healthy exchange of trade with foreign nations. While the North was able to get needed supplies and products, the South had to make do with what it had. As the war dragged on, there were fewer and fewer supplies of basic food and clothing. It was not at all unusual for Confederate troops to wage war on bare feet. The blockade prevented foreign exchange, and as a result, there was no way to purchase the steel necessary to rebuild the industrial infrastructure. Okay. They ran low on clothes, which means they would fight in their bare feet. They ran low on food. They were unable to rebuild industries. Sounds like an N, doesn't it? Since much of the Civil War was fought on Southern soil, the Confederate economy took hit after hit. Farms and factories laid waste by advancing Union troops. Everywhere they went, miles of rails were destroyed, leaving the South unable to move troops and supplies as quickly as the North. Nearly half of all livestock and farm machinery were destroyed, which led the South being unable to raise crops or feed the population and the army. The destruction of factories made it difficult or impossible to replace weapons, trains, and other war necessities. Okay, so they couldn't rebuild industries. They couldn't move troops as quickly. There's just so much they couldn't do. They couldn't rebuild the factories. Like the North, the war's continuing battles took a heavy toll on human life. The problem was more acute in the South due to a much smaller population. Okay, I'm going to put that. Smaller population. Considering the fact that the South had more than a third of its soldiers killed or wounded, there was little chance for the Confederacy to replenish its army. Consequently, the South found itself more and more outnumbered on the battlefield with ill-equipped soldiers. More so than in the North, families suffered tremendously. Women found themselves unable to provide for the basic necessities for their children. Food shortages became more prolonged as women found themselves unable to manage larger farms. Slaves were refusing to work or leaving altogether, creating a shortage of labor. Okay, so now they have a shortage of labor. Without the ability to make money, the Confederate government could not ease the financial burden, so people went hungry. After the war ended, it would take many years to rebuild the South's economy. Let's review. Before completing the problem set, make sure you understand the main points of the lesson. Success in life is affected by the ability to adapt to change. New advancements in weaponry and old methods of fighting by generals created a great loss of life during the war. Many leaders followed the tactics of Napoleon Bonaparte, who had mastered the art of war. His knowledge was based, however, on archaic weapons, not the advanced ones capable of killing many men in a short time. The issues the North faced as war progressed included shortage in manpower, which caused more and more boys to enter the war as soldiers, a staggering war debt, which was partially overcome by a healthy foreign trade policy. Many women were forced to work in factories, offices, and as nurses to meet the needs of the war effort. The issues the Confederacy faced were far more serious. The Union blockade of southern ports prevented trade from foreign nations. This caused an extreme shortage in badly needed supplies, food, clothing, and weaponry. Much of the war was fought on southern soil, resulting in the destruction of farms, factories, machinery, railroads, and livestock. About a third of all men who went off to war were killed or wounded, resulting in manpower shortage. The South was unable to rebuild its army, and therefore they faced becoming heavily outnumbered later on. Women were forced to run factories and farms while trying to meet the basic needs of their children. Food and clothing shortages were prolonged and widespread. Okay. Some of that we talked about in the last lesson, so some of this is review. Go ahead and answer the questions and study this lesson.